There are names you can put there. Everybody got a story, including you.
Bernard Hopkins fought for nearly 30 years, breaking records, outlasting legends, and writing his name in boxing history. But the opponent that left the biggest scar wasn't the most famous. He wasn't even the fiercest. He was the most unexpected. And to this day, Hopkins calls that night the one that truly changed him. Bernard Hopkins is hands down one of the greatest boxers in history. But this greatness didn't happen causally. Bernard dragged himself to it through grit, pain, discipline, and the kind of patience that would break most people. Legendary fighters like Mayweather, Tyson, and Pacquiao made their mark early and lived in the spotlight. But Hopkins? He took the long road that didn't come with instant fame or viral knockouts. He had to show up year after year, fight after fight, just to prove he belonged. By the time he finally hung up his gloves in 2016, Hopkins had fought 67 professional bouts, racked up 55 wins, and scored 32 knockouts. But the numbers only scratched the surface. This was a man who didn't just last in boxing, he mastered it. His career began in 1988 and spanned the end of the Cold War, the rise of the internet, and 2 generations of fighters who came, peaked, and disappeared while he stayed in the conversation. And through all that time, he kept evolving. Early on, he was known as the Executioner, who was cold, clinical, and ruthless in the ring. But as the years passed, the boxing world expected his body to slow, but he only got sharper. And that's when he embraced his second nickname, the Alien, because no one at his age should have been doing what he was doing. By 46, most fighters were done, but Hopkins was still dominating the industry. And he didn't stop there. At 48, he beat Tavoris Cloud to claim another belt. At 49, he took down Beibut Shumenov. These fights weren't exhibitions. They were real, sanctioned championship fights against younger and stronger men who trained to defeat him. But Hopkins didn't just survive. He picked them apart slowly and methodically. His ability to outlast a younger fighter wasn't luck. Hopkins had strategically trained for it. While other fighters spent their off-seasons partying, eating garbage, or taking punishment in sparring, Hopkins lived clean. He didn't drink, eat processed food, or indulge in unhealthy habits. He trained year-round, staying close to fighting shape even when he had no bout lined up. He wanted to stay ready to go 12 rounds on any given night. That's why, when others aged out of contention, he aged into it. Hopkins didn't just break records. He shattered the ones no one thought would ever be touched. He holds the title of oldest world champion in boxing history, and not just once. He broke his own record multiple times. This speaks to something deeper than skill or even toughness. It shows just how much control Hopkins had over his mind, body, and his opponents. And despite not having the showbiz charisma of some of his peers, he made a lot of money. Hopkins didn't flash wealth on social media or flaunt luxury the way others did, but he played the business side of boxing smartly. He partnered with Golden Boy Promotions, learned the mechanics of the industry, and put himself in a position where he wasn't just a fighter, but an investor in his own future. By 2025, his net worth was estimated to be around $40 million. His biggest payday was his showdown with Oscar de la Hoya, when he made a cool $10 million in one night. But none of it ever seemed to change him. He didn't balloon between fights, or crumble under the pressure of fame, or waste years chasing knockouts or gimmick matches. Every move was measured, and every word had weight. There's a reason Bernard Hopkins doesn't fit cleanly into most boxing highlight reels. This is because he wasn't built for spectacle, but for substance. He learned how to wear his opponents down mentally and make them question their game plan. And by the time they realized it, he already had them cornered. And in a sport where intelligence often gets overlooked in favor of brute force, this skill made him dangerous. But most fans never realized that the titles, the records, the money, and the legacy didn't come from a place of privilege or comfort. It came from somewhere darker. Because before Bernard Hopkins became the executioner or the alien, he actually faced the devastating possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. Long before Bernard Hopkins ever laced up gloves for a world title, his hands were in handcuffs. And this is the part of his story that most people gloss over. Most fans struggle with the uncomfortable truth that before Hopkins was a world champion, he was actually a teenage convict with no direction and no reason to believe he'd ever amount to anything. At just 17, Hopkins was already deep into a life of crime. He wasn't just stealing for survival. He was chasing status in the streets of North Philadelphia, running with the wrong crowd, and pushing limits that had consequences. Unsurprisingly, the law eventually caught up to him, and he was handed an 18-year sentence and thrown into Graterford Prison, one of the roughest correctional facilities in the state. Although he didn't serve the full term because he got out after nearly 5 years, what happened inside that correctional facility left a permanent mark. Hopkins later revealed that he witnessed violence like never before, and it shook him to his core. But Hopkins wasn't desensitized. If anything, the time he spent there snapped something in him into place. He walked out of prison in 1988 with one goal and one mindset: to never go back there. And he succeeded with that. He didn't just stay out of prison, he made sure his life would never circle that drain again. What followed was a daily grind fueled by self-discipline so extreme it bordered on obsession. Hopkins rebuilt himself from the inside out. He changed what he ate, how he trained, what he read, who he trusted, and how he spoke. But he didn't trade the street instincts in him for silence. In fact, his edge never dulled. In the ring, he knew how to get inside an opponent's head, and sometimes this led him into some of the most controversial moments of his career. Before his fight with Felix Trinidad, Hopkins took things too far. He stepped into Puerto Rico and threw their flag to the ground during a press event. The fans lost it, and riots broke out. His action was not just disrespectful, it was reckless and completely calculated. But Hopkins was just trying to get inside Trinidad's mind and pull the wires loose before the first bell ever rang. This was the summary of his game. To Hopkins, boxing didn't begin in the ring. It began the moment you signed the contract. And no matter how much backlash he got, he never flinched. He lived in the psychological realm of the sport. His opponents trained for his body, but most of them weren't ready for his mind. He could frustrate them, rattle them, and even humiliate them. He didn't need to outpunch you if he could outthink you. And yet, even with all the mental warfare, what made it all land was the fact that he backed it up physically, again and again. In his 40s, Hopkins did what most athletes can't even pretend to do by staying sharp. While younger fighters struggled with weight cuts, burnout, and layoffs, Hopkins trained like he was still 25. But this discipline, toughness, and razor-sharp intensity didn't come from some motivational speech. It came from the fear of going back to where he came from. To Hopkins, everything about his lifestyle was the only thing standing between him and the version of himself that might have died in prison. But every fighter, no matter how disciplined, has felt fear in the ring. And Hopkins was no exception. He'd fought the best of the best, shared the ring with legends, and outlasted generations. But there was one opponent who hit him so hard and so cleanly that he still remembers the impact. Not just physically, but emotionally. It wasn't Roy Jones Jr. or Felix Trinidad who left this lasting impact on Hopkins. It was someone else entirely who most people have forgotten. When fans talk about Bernard Hopkins and his greatest rivals, the usual names like Roy Jones Jr., Oscar de la Hoya, Felix Trinidad, and Joe Calzaghe always float to the top. These were the showdowns that made headlines and filled arenas. But there was one opponent who Hopkins never forgot. This boxer hit the hardest and rattled him in ways Hopkins hadn't experienced before. This boxer was Antoine Eccles, and to Hopkins, he was a nightmare in gloves. But for the casual fan, Eccles wasn't even a household name. He didn't become a crossover star or end his career with multiple belts or a polished resume. But when he stepped into the ring with Hopkins, it was a fight to remember. The first time the two men met was in December 1999. Hopkins was already the reigning International Boxing Federation middleweight champion and deep into a dominant title reign. Eccles came in as a heavy hitter with a record that demanded attention. He had 32 wins, and 28 of them were by knockout. That's not just power, that's a wrecking ball walking into the ring. And from the opening bell, Hopkins could feel it. Eccles didn't have the finesse of Roy Jones or the timing of Oscar de la Hoya, but every time he threw a punch, it carried real danger. According to Hopkins, there was no fluff in his combinations or any wasted movement. And when he landed a blow, you felt it through your bones. Hopkins was known for his defensive mastery and surgical game plans, but he had to put in more effort than expected just to keep control during the match. He won the fight by a clear, unanimous decision, but it wasn't without damage or risk. What most fans didn't know was that underneath the calm exterior Hopkins showed that night, there was real concern that would eventually translate into respect for Eccles. Hopkins developed a kind of survival instinct that has never kicked in for every opponent he faced, and he had to stay locked in from the first round to the last, because one clean shot from Eccles could have rewritten the entire story of his reign. But even after that match, fate wasn't done with them just yet. Exactly 1 year later, in December 2000, Hopkins and Eccles were matched again for another title defense and war. But this time, things escalated. Eccles came in looking wilder and more aggressive than Hopkins, swinging for the knockout like a man who knew this was his final shot at history. And for a while, it looked like he might get it. In the early rounds, Eccles landed a series of thudding and punishing shots. He didn't have the precision to break Hopkins down round by round, but he didn't even need to. All he needed was one perfect moment and one mistake from Hopkins. However, Hopkins never gave it to him. By the middle rounds, Hopkins had taken control again. He started neutralizing Eccles' wild energy, forcing him to miss, tiring him out, and making him pay for every reckless swing. And in the 10th round, it was over. Hopkins closed the show with a technical knockout, ending the rivalry for good. But even in victory, he came out of that fight with a truth he never let go of. Eccles could hit like no one else. What made that revelation so compelling wasn't just the shock of it, it was the context. Hopkins had faced legends. He'd been in the ring with fighters celebrated for their knockout power, their explosive speed, and their dominance. But Eccles, he was different, raw, and unrefined. His power was the kind that made your instincts kick in and reminded even the most technical fighter that a single punch can change everything. And maybe that's why Hopkins never forgot him. Power like that stays with you, not just in your memory, but in your body. In an interview, when asked which boxer hit him the hardest, he said, "Antoine Eccles. He was clubbing, not swift. Thumping. He was really one-dimensional. He had great success fighting one-dimensional people. That's not a knock on him, but when you run into Bernard Hopkins, who's more than one-dimensional, then you got a problem." I'm going to stick with Antoine Eccles. He could crack. But the tragedy of Antoine Eccles is that his name was never etched into the sport the way his fists should have earned. After the Hopkins rematch, his career slowly drifted into journeyman territory, a term used to describe a fighter who is always in the game but not typically in title contention. The wins came less often, the knockouts dried up, and the spotlight moved on. Outside the ring, things got even harder. Eccles battled personal demons, health issues, and financial hardship. He struggled to get the right fights, the right support, and the right chances. And while his name faded from headlines, the man himself never stopped fighting. Unfortunately, in 2023, his final round came, not in the ring, but in life. Antoine Eccles passed away after a long battle with diabetes at the age of 52. There were no big tributes from the networks or special dedications, but the real ones, and the fighters who felt his power firsthand, remembered. Bernard Hopkins, in particular, didn't forget. Because no matter how history books rank fighters, pain remembers pain. And Hopkins knew what it meant to take one of Eccles' shots and still be standing. But while Eccles may have been the hardest puncher Hopkins ever faced, he was far from the only opponent who earned Hopkins' deep respect inside the ring. Two names stand out prominently in the arc of Hopkins' career for entirely different reasons. Felix Trinidad, the Puerto Rican powerhouse who arrived with an undefeated record and thunderous reputation, and Sergey Kovalev, the cold, calculating Russian whose strength and style pushed Hopkins to the limits late in his career. Hopkins' 2001 showdown with Trinidad was more than a boxing match. It was a turning point that redefined both men's legacies. Trinidad, undefeated at the time with a record of 40-0 and 33 knockouts, was considered one of the most dangerous punchers of his era. He had demolished opponents at welterweight and junior middleweight before moving up to middleweight, where many expected him to roll through the division just as easily. Hopkins, then the International Boxing Federation champion with little mainstream spotlight, entered the fight as the underdog, but with an intense focus on dismantling Trinidad's aura of invincibility. What followed was one of Hopkins' most strategic and disciplined performances. He used footwork, timing, and a stiff jab to neutralize Trinidad's power while exposing flaws in his defense. Hopkins respected Trinidad not only for his punching ability, but also for his relentless pressure and willingness to take risks. Even as Hopkins built momentum through the later rounds, he never let his guard down. Trinidad's danger remained present until the final moments of the 12th round, when Hopkins delivered a decisive knockout. That win unified the three different titles and catapulted Hopkins into boxing's global spotlight, but he never dismissed the quality of the opponent. In later interviews, he consistently credited Trinidad as one of the most skilled offensive fighters he had ever prepared for, noting the combination of speed, power, and aggression that made him such a threat. More than a decade later, Hopkins would again test himself against another feared puncher, this time under very different circumstances. In 2014, at age 49, Hopkins faced Sergey Kovalev in a unification bout that many believed was a bridge too far, even for a fighter as experienced and disciplined as Hopkins. Kovalev, then holding the World Boxing Organization light heavyweight title, was in his physical prime. He was known not just for his knockout power, but also for his precision and composure. Hopkins entered the ring that night as the title holder, already having defied age expectations by winning titles in his late 40s. But Kovalev presented a new kind of challenge, a heavy-handed fighter who didn't waste punches and maintained relentless pressure with minimal openings. Hopkins, who had made a career out of exposing younger fighters' inexperience and lapses in judgment, found himself outboxed, outmaneuvered, and, for the first time, physically overwhelmed. The unanimous decision loss marked the most dominant defeat of Hopkins' long career, yet he made no excuses. After the fight, Hopkins made it clear that Kovalev was one of the most complete fighters he had ever faced. He acknowledged Kovalev's balance of patience and pressure, his ability to cut off the ring, and his refusal to take reckless chances. Hopkins had spent decades studying opponents, looking for patterns to exploit, but Kovalev gave him little to work with. It wasn't just power that earned Hopkins's respect in that fight. It was control, discipline, and execution. Both Trinidad and Kovalev represented different eras and styles, but they shared a common thread. They came into the ring prepared, confident, and with the skills to back it up. Hopkins respected them because they weren't hype-driven contenders. They were legitimate champions who brought danger, intelligence, and pedigree. While he found a way to outthink Trinidad and ultimately couldn't solve Kovalev, both men earned permanent space in Hopkins's mental catalog of elite fighters, not for flash or fame, but for the way they demanded the best version of him. At 60, Bernard Hopkins doesn't sit around bathing in nostalgia or polishing trophies. He's not one to dwell on belts or brag about the decades he ruled boxing. Instead, he reflects on something wonderful and impactful: the years he had in the industry. For Hopkins, true toughness isn't in the headlines. It's not in the glamour of pay-per-view sales or the sparkle of championship gold. It's in the silent, terrifying moments when your opponent could end your night with a single shot. Hopkins today is still lean, still sharp, and still capable of dissecting a fighter's flaws after just one round. He watches the sport like a surgeon, never far from the mindset that kept him dominant for so long. But he also talks about things with the clarity of someone who's lived through every storm, from prison yards to sold-out arenas, from being counted out to becoming a world champion in his late 40s. And when you look at his story in full, it's not about being the most popular. It's about never backing down from the truth. Who do you think was Hopkins's toughest opponent? Tell us in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and check out more videos from this channel.